Friday night, hundreds of white nationalists storming the University of Virginia, protesting plans to remove a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. The overnight violence spilling into this morning when marchgoers and counter-protesters clash again, hours before the Unite to Right march was even set to begin. Just after 10:30 a.m., the crowd growing in size. Local and state police in riot gear responding in force, but the violence escalating. Just before noon, Virginia's governor declaring a state of emergency. Just before 2 p.m., the situation taking that deadly turn.
You can see the silver 2010 Dodge Challenger barreling down the hill toward a sea of targets with little time to react, slamming to a stop only after it hit a van and another car. Locked in, that car shifting in reverse, screeching back down the street to get away. One person, a 32-year-old woman, left dead. 19 more rushed to the hospital, 5 in critical condition.
August 12th, 2017, Charlottesville, Virginia. One woman killed, dozens injured over a protest about a statue of a Civil War general over a century and a half after the conflict had ended. More than any other war, the Civil War has cast a long shadow on American society, not only because of the hundreds of thousands of lives lost, but also because the conflict left a legacy of social strife that has persisted to this very day. Americans still engage in heated debates about the Civil War, not just as a matter of historical interest, but as a question that has a direct bearing on how race and racism operate in American society to this very day. So what I'm going to talk about today is the memory of the Civil War, or more specifically, how that memory both shapes and is informed by the racial dynamics of American society in the 20th and 21st centuries. In this respect, it's worth remembering the events of Charlottesville in 2017 were preceded by an even bloodier event only 2 years earlier. On June 17, 2015, a 21-year-old white man by the name of Dylan Roof entered into the Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, this isn't just any church. This is a historical church commonly known as Mother Emanuel. It's the first independent black congregation found in the South, one of the two oldest black churches in the United States. So anyway, on June 17th, around 9 in the evening, Roof walks into the church and he makes his way to a Bible study meeting that's being held there with about 13 other people, all of them black. He enters into the room, he's welcomed, he sits in on the meeting, people have a discussion about scripture, he makes some disagreements about some of the interpretation, and then they start to pray. And as they start to pray, Roof pulls out a Glock pistol from his fanny pack, and he aims it at an 87-year-old woman by the name of Susie Jackson. And her grandnephew, whose name is Tywanza Sanders, sees what's happening and he tries to talk him down. He intervenes, and Roof answered and apparently says this. He says, "I have to do it. You rape our women and you're taking over our country and you have to go." And so Sanders realizes what's about to go down. He throws himself in front of Jackson, his great aunt, and Dylan Roof begins firing and firing. And he fires so many times that he actually reloads his pistol 5 times, all the while yelling racial epithets. Within 9 minutes, 9 were dead. 6 women, 3 men, lying in pools of blood on the church floor. Clementa Pinckney, who was the church's pastor and also a South Carolina state senator, Cynthia Marie Graham Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lee Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Tywanza Sanders, Daniel Simmons, Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Myra Thompson, all of them killed by Dylan Roof. So the massacre of 9 churchgoers was horrifying in its own right, but especially so since Roof's motives were so clearly steeped in racial hatred. And this was a racial hatred that was in turn steeped in Confederate mythology. So Charleston, remember, was the city where the Civil War began. The first shots of the war were fired at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The first state to secede was South Carolina, which was so anxious to do so after the election of Abraham Lincoln that they issued an early declaration before the secession convention, which stated that, quote, a geographical line has been drawn across the Union with the election of Abraham Lincoln, whose crime was that his, quote, opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. And the streets of Charleston, even today, are teeming with reminders of that history. It's hard to travel very far in the city without encountering some memorial to the Confederacy. And Dylann Roof was immersed in that heritage. He grew up in Charleston and was something of a, for lack of a better word, a loser, who had never found a direction in life. Eventually, he got involved in petty crime, had several run-ins with the police, but leading up to the massacre, even though he had a number of black friends, he became increasingly interested and obsessed with white supremacist culture. So he taps into an online network. He's logging in on his computer to have discussions with neo-Nazis, apartheid fetishists, stormfront types. But above all else, he developed a fascination with Confederate iconography, photographing himself multiple times in front of stars and bars, the stars and bars of the Confederate battle flag, and alluding constantly to the Confederate heritage of white Southerners. After the massacre happened, many Americans were horrified by the connection between Roof's hate crime and the symbols of the Confederacy, and they began a campaign which continues to this present day, and it's really spearheaded by African American activists, to remove memorials to Confederate heroes not only in Charleston, but in cities and counties and towns all over the South, and in fact beyond the South. And this was the context of the events in Charlottesville in 2017. The city council there had decided to remove a statue of Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Army of Virginia, who had become a symbol of Southern white masculinity and valor, and various neo-Confederate, alt-right, and neo-Nazi types had converged in Charlottesville to protest its removal. The case for keeping statues was not only made by avowed white supremacists, but also by many ordinary white Southerners who insisted that they were not inspired by racism or support of slavery, but rather simply wanted to honor their ancestors. Heritage, not hate, was a stock phrase that they used and continue to use. Many of these white Southerners insisted there was in fact white Southerners who were the true victims of the Civil War, and that the war had been caused by an overly aggressive, indeed tyrannical government led by Abraham Lincoln and carried out by henchmen such as Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman. And many Southern nationalists called the conflict the War of Northern Aggression, not the Civil War, but the War of Northern Aggression, which was waged by the South in order to protect states' rights, or the right of Southern states to govern their own affairs, and which the North engaged in order to impose a centralizing nationalism. So these Southern nationalists said the war had absolutely nothing to do with slavery, they insisted. And they even argued that black Southerners were relatively happy under the existing regime and indeed had signed up for military service on behalf of the Confederacy. That fact is not really true, but it has a kind of mythology that there were black Confederates. So this point of view, the view that Southern nationalists have espoused and continue to espouse, is often called the lost cause interpretation of the war, after a book that was published by Edward Pollard, who was a Virginia journalist, in 1866, so the year after the war had ended. And then he actually follows it up with another book a couple of years later in 1868 called The Lost Cause Regained. So the first book treats the war as a conflict between two opposing ways of organizing society, and saw slavery as a key part of what made the South noble and a key difference of what made the two societies different. The second work, however, argued that the primary reason for secession was not slavery, but the preservation of state sovereignty. Right? So even though Pollard actually still defends slavery, he frames it as something that was not central to the cause of secession. It's not central to the cause of the Confederacy. And so this becomes a persistent interpretation. It persists to this very day. If you look at internet comment sections, if you look at popular culture, this is a very frequent phrase, which is that the Confederacy is defending states' rights and that the war had nothing to do with slavery at all. Now, of course, this is based on a distorted and intellectually dishonest interpretation of the war, but the fact that it continues into the 21st century with very little basis in the historical record deserves an explanation. So why do people still buy into this self-serving explanation of what the war is about? So one useful way of thinking about this comes from historian David Blight, who published a book called Race and Reunion. And so he offers a framework that helps to explain why people bought into the lost cause mythology. So he presents three different frameworks for remembering the war, three different ways in which people have thought about what the war was about, how they understood its meaning, how they understood what its significance was to American society. So the first of these is what he calls reconciliationists. So the reconciliationist memory, the reconciliationist understanding of the Civil War emphasizes the North and the South coming together after the war in order to reunite, in order to recreate the country as a nation that embodies both the former remnants of the Confederacy and the victorious Union. The second framework is what he calls emancipationist. So the emancipationist understanding is one that puts slavery and the end of slavery front and center. So from this point of view, the war is clearly a war that's fought for freedom. It's a war that's fought for emancipation, and this point of view is found in the writings of Frederick Douglass or in the speeches of Abraham Lincoln, whether it's the Gettysburg Address or his second inaugural address as president, in which he describes slavery or the war as a kind of blood sacrifice of the country in order to expiate the sin of slavery. Now there's also a third framework, which he refers to as white supremacist. So this point of view is that there's a natural order to society in which white Americans are on top, blacks are naturally on bottom. The war and Reconstruction had presented a sort of temporary inversion of that natural order, but with the end of Reconstruction, you had a reversion to the norm, which is the kind of white supremacist society was established through Jim Crow.